everybody to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be with you again. It's been a couple of weeks. Um, Today, I have Ahmed Al, and he is a political economist who studies the Middle East, North Africa region. And he's also from Gaza, from my understanding, originally. And so he was connected to us from Ziad Al Nabolsi, who folks will remember we've had a couple of different conversations with over the last couple of years, and then also was recently on the East is a podcast with Sina Rahmani, did an episode on the Gaza pier and you know what is this thing? What does it mean? What does it mean? What is the how would a pier um, what would the role of a peer be for Palestinians, right? And what is the role of this U.S., strange thing that keeps getting put together, dismantled, and so on. And so we'll talk a little bit about that for sure, as well as some broader questions around, oh, audio is weak. Okay, I gotta fix my audio. Hang on a second, everybody. Thank you for that.
All right, that should be better. Again, apologies on that. I have to remember to check that every time. Um, so we'll get into all of those things and more, and hopefully some of your questions as well. Um, all right. So Ahmed, welcome to the show. It's great to be in conversation with you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm really, I appreciate your work. You have a lot of writing, by the way. You have your own Substack, right? And then you're writing for various other publications. And I was just kind of looking through it. Like there's a recent piece for Mondo Weiss about the pier, but you've written other stuff for them. And then um, a lot of just interesting stuff around, which I want to get into too, around like trade, political economy, the region. And I think that's all, stuff that we haven't explored as much on the podcast is some of the political, economic, and trade related aspects of this war, but also the importance of Gaza specifically as a kind of geostrategic location for major powers, and obviously, for Palestinians, for, of course, personal national reasons. But yeah, so we'll get into some of that. So to start, let's kind of start there with the political economic importance of Palestine in general, and Gaza specifically, kind of within the world system and in relation to Western and US imperial interests.
Sure. Thank you, Jared, for giving me this opportunity to discuss such topics. I think you can really trace the importance of Palestine really back far in history. Depending on which empire we're talking about, the interests were different. I think we're mostly focused on more modern times Palestine, which essentially dates back to the British Mandate, when the British tried to take Palestine as a way to maintain their control in the region so that they can control their energy supplies and make sure that they have security over those so that they could fuel their own industrial enterprises. And that was essentially the goal of many other empires in the region who sought to secure the Gulf energy resources so that they can get supplies sufficient to support their industrial revolution. And that's what drove many other powers, such as France, to be involved in the region, and also the United States of America. That essentially was the core interest of many of these powers, because many of these states weren't even states at the time. They were part of other empires. They were really weak. They were fragile. They didn't really constitute particular security risks directly to these states, but they could potentially disrupt the supply lines that they could use to get the energy that they want from that region. Um, Now, what emerged after that was the rise of Arab nationalism. So the region supply lines became more interesting and more. There was more need to secure them, but from a different kind of danger, which is essentially that Arab nationalism threatened to nationalize many of the oil interests and the oil assets, and also conducted wars which could potentially disrupt these supplies. So that's where Palestine became even more important for many of these powers to disrupt the independence of Palestine, because that meant ultimately that many of the actors, Arab nationalists, will be disrupted and will not be able to disrupt this hegemonic and imperialist interest. Um, Now, moving forward a little bit till today, after the war with Egypt in 1973, there was some sort of like a regional broader stability, relatively speaking, and Palestine became less of a source of worry, and more countries wanted to resolve the conflict so that they can move to the new Middle East, which what Israel has been essentially planning and working on the region for the past 30 or 40 years. And the idea was that if we resolve the Palestinian conflict, we can make Israel the economic and the financial hub in the region, and therefore other countries who are already in peace agreements with Israel, or others that will join them later, which obviously what happened in the Abraham Accords, will rely on Israel being the center, and that's how the United States would maintain its hegemony in the region, particularly with the rise of China and with the rise of Russia and the United States going back to great power politics. They wanted a regional order which will ensure the US maintains hegemony, but at the same time, it does not really disrupt the arrangement that has existed for the past century. And that's essentially what the United States has been trying to work out, is how to make Israel the center of the region. In 2020, they launched the Abraham Accords, making Palestine essentially a non existent entity. And on that entity, a regional broader peace would flourish, and Palestinians will sort of become part of Israel, live without political rights, experience crackdowns every here and then, and ultimately use sophisticated technology, AIs, big data, facial recognition to police them in a very efficient and organized manner, which would not make the people and the world know exactly that what is happening is occupation. Now, focal to why Palestine now becomes the center for not just Israel, but for the rest of the world as well, is the EMIC, which was announced in 2023 by the US President Joe Biden during the G20 meeting in September. Um the EMIC essentially is an abbreviation for India, Middle East, Europe economic corridors. And these were envisaged as corridors that would create gas pipelines, data connections, data cables that would link India, the Middle East, and Israel through Jordan all the way to Europe. And that ultimately would have made effectively Israel the hub for the region, because it connects the south and the north. And in September of last year, the Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu went out in the United Nations and shown a map where he essentially declared Israel being the king of the Middle East and that Palestine no longer exists. And that was essentially why, for Israel to be hit hard on the 7th of October, was a wake up call. It destroyed, it shattered their dreams, it shattered their vision, it shattered the promise that Israel is going to become now the center of the region. That they are going to normalize ties with Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries, and invade, sort of conquer the world, and gain legitimacy, economic interests, etc. And that's why, for Israel, the United States, Gulf countries, and other powerful actors in the world, the attack that happened on the 7th of October destroyed many of their dreams. And that's why now the main interest is trying to undermine the success that happened on the 7th, so that they can undermine any possibility for the change that can happen in the regional balance of power, and by extension to the imperial hegemonic order that exists.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I want to, you know, I want to talk more about that because I think it's a really good and important way for us to think about October 7th, and what the stakes of that are, what the stakes of the current, why is the genocide continuing to go on, and so on. And So we'll get there in a bit, but I do want to. You've done some work, and I mentioned the podcast with Sina Rahmani, which I recommend people check out. You also have an article I'll put in the show notes. Um, but you talk about the pier, this military, um, you know, I don't even know how you describe it. It's like a set of pontoons that are like put together, very expensive, technical ones, of course. Um, and so obviously there's the US's vision for this and what the purposes of it from their perspective, which I would love to hear you talk a little bit about. But also you talk in that conversation with Sina about the history of Hamas and Gaza kind of trying to establish a pier or a port of their own. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit about kind of the stakes of that from your perspective and what you think is important in thinking about the pier.
Sure. So the idea of the pair isn't actually particularly new. When the Palestinian Authority signed, when the Palestinian Liberation Organization signed the Oslo Accord and they created the Palestinian Authority, part of the envisaged economic peace plans were expected to result a port. It was called the Gaza port. It was actually it had a designated location of Gaza shores, which you would normally be able to see. There was a sign that would say this is designated for the Gaza port. And as I know through work and other sources, that the Europeans have funded indeed a feasibility study for a port in Gaza, which costed around 16 million euros at the time, or dollars. And there was a vision for something like that. And there was also a vision for an airport, which Palestinians ultimately also had, which called the Rafah airport, worked for about a year or two. And then Israel destroyed it with the rise, with the Second Intifada beginning. So the idea was always there, but when the peace negotiations failed and the Second Intifada began, people stopped talking about it because it wasn't feasible, it wasn't reasonable, and particularly because it was also linked to the Gaza gas reserves. People didn't really want to talk about it because it would have, by extension, ultimately meant that we have to talk about, okay, so Gaza also has gas reserves. Can this port be used to export it? Does it need to be prepared to be able to process these gas reserves, etc. So nobody talked about it for some time until and when Hamas took power, there was always this talk about allowing fishermen to go fish in the sea, giving them 6 miles, 3 miles, 9 miles. Ultimately, what happened in 2014 is that part of the sort of unspoken, unwritten agreement between Hamas and Israel was that we would get a port in Gaza, and Gaza would ultimately be able to use that port to import and export to the world, and also be able to move people in theory. That never actually materialized because, as always, Israel reneged on that promise and used it just as a card against Hamas to ask for more compromises. But Hamas has took initiative and built a port, sort of a mini port, mini pier in Khan Yunis city, which you can still see some photos of online if you search for them. And that was supposed to be sort of like the beginning of something bigger as the situation allowed. Now, in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, Sinwar goes out in a bizarre moment and says that Gaza is going to be established a maritime trade route with the axis of resistance. He says that in a speech, and everybody is wondering what is he talking about? Where would that even be possible? We live under siege. We can't even travel freely. How could we even get a maritime? Negatively by many people, and people thought that these are some of the other exaggerations that at the time people thought Sinwar had kind of dreamed about rather than ultimately realize whether they can achieve it or not. Fast forward today, when the war happened, and that pier essentially got destroyed, the Khan Yunis pier, there was a lot of talk in Israel and in the United States about the potentiality to include Gaza in the greater picture, the EMIC that we discussed earlier. Because from the United States point of view, the EMIC is more about securing the supply lines of the US military rather than disrupting Israel or making Israel a center of the region. And if Gaza gets support, which what we Palestinians want to do ultimately after the war, as part of breaking the siege demands, then that can cause some disruption to the EMEC because it can be a competitive, it can host hostile forces, and they didn't really want to do that. So, what was the genius idea that was brought onto the table is building the port themselves. Uh, but this is not to say that they wanted to build the port so that they can help Palestinians achieve economic goals or get some independence or get some more dignity. No, the goal was actually to occupy that space so it disrupts the potential of actually building any proper port in the future. And they actually built that port not far away from where the original port was envisaged to be by the PA back in the 90s. And that port pier essentially became problematic ever since because um, it was linked to the process of starving Palestinians inside Gaza by when Israel closed Rafah crossing. Essentially, everybody looked at the pier as the only means for aid to enter into Gaza, and that leveraged the Israeli and the American position against Hamas. And people start claiming that the pier is being used as a starvation weapon by saying, "We have your food, it's right here on our ship, but we're not going to give it to you unless you do such and such." So the pair was received in the beginning with a friendly note by Hamas. They thought that it could be part of a greater package, such as the airdrops. Then you have the land crossings, but you also can have the port. But they never really thought, and they explicitly say that we don't envisage that this port will ultimately become a replacement for the land cruises, which where you can get much more aid at much quicker speeds and with higher security for people. Because as you can probably saw in many videos, airdrops ultimately damaged many homes and many people who were nearby. Um, Now, the question around the pair uh, becomes more problematic as more Palestinian factions start realizing that the pair could be potentially used for military use cases. And one of the fears that many people kind of wondered that could potentially be used for is forced migration. So pushing people out of the strip into other countries because that's what essentially Israel wanted to do after Rafah sort of forced displacement failed because Egypt resisted. So the fear, one of the greatest fear were about the port is that it might potentially be used by the United States and Israel and other regional actors to displace Palestinians, which then essentially would be sold out to the Israeli public and to the world as a defeat for Hamas, delegitimizes Hamas, and makes Hamas and resistance look as something that has caused defeat to the people rather than made them achieve their national objectives. Um, Now, when the Nusayrat massacre happened and the Israelis freed some of their hostages that were held there through killing about 300 or 400 Palestinians at the time, it became very clear to many people who were in doubt that the pier was actually used by the United States and Israel to facilitate that operation. It became undisputable that that the goal behind the pier ultimately is militarily because much of the aid that has went through the pier didn't actually go through to Gaza. The amounts that ever were let into Gaza by the pier were very, very small because the pier most of the time were either having issues because of weather or having maintenance issues. And some Palestinian factions as well have launched some mortar shells on the pier as a warning sign that this shouldn't be used for military reasons. But the fears that people had about the pier became materialized with the Nusayrat camp. There is also greater worry that because the resistance in Gaza is attacking the supply lines of the Israeli military from from the eastern side of the strip, which normally would come from Israel. There is worry that Israel and the United States are facilitating the entry of some military equipment, supply lines, food, etc., to the Israeli military through that port under the guise and the packaging of aid, which nobody can question. And essentially, after the Nusayrat camp, it was done. Most of Palestinian factions essentially said that they are dealing with this as part of the occupation force, that they deem the pier as to be problematic, have demanded that the pier be evacuated, and it was indeed evacuated some days ago. It remains to be unclear what will be the future of the pier. My information, my sources say that the pier is now, that Hamas has now told the Americans that they would not wish for for the pier to be operated in Gaza, as it became clear to them that is now a military tool used by Israel and the United States to advance military objectives rather than help humans in need. Um, yeah.
Great, thank you for that. All right, let's see. So you kind of gave an overview of, what what it's been used for so far. I mean, this has been something that, people have talked about how little. I mean, at certain points there were questions, even in the United States of like Western journalists asking, State Department spokespeople of like, has there actually been any aid delivered by this pier? To which the State Department is like, I'm not sure. I'll have to check on that. I don't think so. um, and then,
Very
so,
mysterious
that's
for some reason. Magic
yeah,
aid.
yeah, yeah, and so that's been part of it, as I mentioned, it's kind of been, at different points because they say, like, the weather or, there was that it's kind of been broken up because it's in these different pieces that connect together
In
and
the summer,
and
mind you.
yeah, and then in another point, they actually took it apart themselves, which may have been perhaps when Hamas told them, "Hey, if you leave that there, we're gonna target it or whatever." I don't know, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that kind of aspect, on the mysterious sort of side of it, or you think you covered that?
Yes, I mean, so one of the I would like to expand on part of that peer story, especially with regard to forced displacement, that
Yeah,
at this point it is becoming very clear that the war is going to last for many years. Um, I'm sad to say that, but it's now obvious that neither Hamas nor Israel are willing, have the appetite, the capability to engage in any prolonged agreement. And the civilian population in Gaza is being exhausted, is being drained. People are really, really tired. People don't even know where to go when they're being asked to leave where they are staying. You can't even be displaced in peace, essentially. And there is worries and fears that at some point the war would take another round with more intensive fighting, and at that point there will be some form of humanitarian corridors, whatever they will decide to create, force many people to find the way out of Gaza to seek safe refuge. Obviously, that's what they say, but the envisaged plan would drive people to go to Cyprus into a processing facility, which will then ultimately help them be relocated to other places such as Lebanon, Turkey, wherever they can go or won't go, and somebody would can host them. Essentially, a very similar scenario to the Syrians, and that ultimately will be used against Hamas and against the resistance to claim that you've been trying to free Palestine for so long. Ultimately, you cause more occupation, more displacement. Uh, so what's the point of resisting? And that's ultimately, I think, the plan. Will it work or not? Will it succeed or not? I highly doubt it will work at this point. People are very well aware of the situation, but my worry is that if they decide to kill, another 30,000 people in a few months, just like it happened in the first 3 months of the war, um, maybe under fear, extreme killing, the massacre. Because today you go in Gaza, there's nearly no house that hasn't been somehow harmed by this conflict, by this war, by this genocide. Um, so I wonder whether people will have the tolerance, will have the resolve, the resilience for that long. But I think that's something that we will very soon know what will be the outcome of something like that.
do you think, hmm, I'll put a pin in that, we'll come back to that a little bit later. So so one of the things, I mean, and this is kind of where I wanted to go actually, is, thinking regionally, right? And thinking in terms of some of the other forces that have been involved within the axis of resistance. One of the major forces have been Ansar Allah in Yemen, and this connects to your work because you do follow trade routes, and I think that's an interesting part of some of your work as I've looked at it, right, is thinking about the axis of resistance through this kind of, thinking about them in relation to trade and logistics and like the importance of um, certain places regionally and globally, really, in terms of the flow of ships, things like this. And obviously, Yemen has been involved in this blockade now for months, for almost as long as the war has been going on, which it's been going on for over 9 months now. So you've written about this and you've thought about this quite a bit. How impactful do you think the Yemeni blockade has been to the Israeli economy? And what are some of the broader political and economic impacts of that blockade, do you think?
Sure. I think the Yemeni blockade on the Red Sea was one of the most important surprises of this war. When I recall in November or December when they first threatened with it, everybody laughed. Everybody thought that they were just being silly. Nobody took it seriously. People thought that they were just like mad and they have these drones that they're going to use and they're going to fail. And it's going to be embarrassing and more like a moral support rather than like an actual military pressure tool. Uh, until obviously the attacks began getting more intensive, more accurate, the damage became more clear, more ships were targeted, some ships were sunk ultimately, and the United States ultimately decides to send warships and destroyer to the region because they realize that without a military solution, there is effectively no way that they can protect the seas as they kind of take that role as the global hegemon. So when the Ansar Allah movement in Yemen decided to undertake this enterprise and impose a siege on the beginning in Israel, but by extension later on the United States and the UK for their military support for Israel and the attempts to attack Yemen as a way to retaliate. They changed. They essentially they changed history for the first time in a very very long time. I can't even remember if there is any similar historical incident where an non-state actor, a group that effectively, were launched about, what effectively is into power about only 10 years ago, now can impose with great capability a siege, not only on Israel, but also on the United States and the UK from the shores of Yemen, the country that has been in war for also nearly 10 years and effectively lives on aid because of the war and its implications. Um, so, uh, Yemen is essentially recreated the idea that countries need to have exceptional powers. They have to have really advanced technology to undertake such a military operation, because it was never something that the poor could ever do. Because not only would it be expensive and hard to do, but also it not be maintainable because it's just so expensive to maintain a war machine and also to hedge against potential retaliation. But Yemen did it, and the United States has been trying to alter the Yemen view on this by many ways, by attacking them, by trying to bribe them, by trying to delegitimize them, by assigning them as a terrorist organization, by trying to delegitimize them by saying they're like a Shiite and stating that sectarian narrative within Yemen and in the region against them. So the United States is very fearful and realizes that as the Houthis continue to have the capability to impose this blockade, there is unlikely anything they can do about it, which means that the economic damage that Israel incurred by the deactivation of effectively deactivation of the port of Eilat and the reduction of its shipping ships to essentially zero or near that, and the inflation that follows because of the pressure on that part of the economy means that the siege will ultimately go to a point where the United States and Israel will have to buckle, especially after that the Mediterranean Sea became part of the equation. Now, the problem with the Mediterranean Sea is that because it's quite far from Yemen, it's quite far from Iraq, it's really hard to actually do the siege effectively as Yemen can do. Sorry. And therefore, there is a lot of thinking that if Hezbollah becomes part of the war, will ultimately impose a siege in the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore that would also add to the pressure on Israel and will increase the pressure on consumer prices and will make more people try to pressure the government to accept a deal and stop the war and move forward into a peace process. But until something of that nature happens, I think that the global dynamics around the pair might play a very odd wild card scenarios because ultimately the Red Sea isn't just used by Israel; it's also used by Europe and the United States military. So if tomorrow there is a war in Taiwan and the United States needs to move ships through the Red Sea to Asia and back and the other side to Europe, they will not be able to do that because the Houthis did say, even if the war finishes in Gaza, we are not going to finish our attacks on the United States and the UK, which means that this siege and this blockade isn't just about Israel Palestine at this point. It also goes beyond into global politics and global dynamics because Russia is now supporting the Houthis and Yemen to countertake these attacks because that's a way for them to retaliate against the Western attacks on Russia, but also a way for them to impose the position into the global supply chain security by saying, look, without us, you can't get security in Yemen, you can't get security in Libya, you can't get security in Sudan, you can't get security in Syria and Lebanon. So that's what I think the Russians ultimately are trying to do, and I think that the Chinese are also happy with that because ultimately they worry and they fear that the United States will ultimately try to use that against them. So they see Russian aggression, although troublesome and causes some disruption, ultimately a good hedge against any potential U.S. intrusion against their supply lines in case there is a war in Taiwan in the future. Because now Russia is building a port in Libya, Sudan, Yemen. They have one in Syria. So as you can see, they are really quite have a stronghold in the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean Sea, and they would like to keep doing that in the future. But again, a war in Taiwan can be a trigger for events and the blockades in the sea to trigger and become a full-blown regional war where essentially the world economy will struggle and at least third of the world supplies will be fully disrupted and will essentially not exist in the market anymore, which will cause massive, massive disruption if it ever happens. Uh, Alternatively, something of that around that line of smaller scale could also happen and cause quite a significant disruption for everyone, really.
Yeah, thank you. When did because at some point, Ansar Allah was very, I thought, clear that their primary purpose for the blockade was just the siege, was to a defensive maneuver in support of Gaza. Was there Do you remember the specific point at which they kind of changed their statements around that in terms of it being bigger than that?
So specific dates, I don't recall. I remember the order of things happening, but rather than the dates. In the beginning, they said they're going to attack the United States and the UK ships because they were supporting Israel and because they were conducting attacks on Yemen. Then they also included the military ships. Then they stopped sinking ships. Then they started sinking more ships and attacking more ships of lately. They also introduced the hypersonic missiles against ships, and they started attacking ships in the Indian Ocean and At some point, there was a trip by the Houthis to Moscow where they were asked about this, and they said, yes, we would like to cooperate with the BRICS countries about changing the global supply line order and trying to change, the politics around that. And they also said they will not support, they will not stop their blockade on the US and the UK in the Red Sea. And I think that's essentially a recognition that as a way for them to get the support of Russia and China in this blockade for Palestine, they are going to provide them with support in their own respective wars in Ukraine and in Taiwan as things escalate.
That's very interesting. Um, all right, so Lebanon has been a topic of a lot of conversation in recent weeks. There's been a lot of kind of agitation. Is it going to be a war? This kind of discussion, right, on a kind of ongoing basis. Both, I mean, globally, but you see it reflected within Israeli press. Within press coming out of Lebanon and so on. And so, as well as through discussions from Nasrallah, and others. So I find it's just on a personal level, it's really hard for me to imagine that given how much difficulty the IOF and Israel and the United States have had in securing objectives in Gaza, that they would want to go up against an even larger army, and one that has already won wars with against Israel in the past. And so um but it's hard to know, right? Because it doesn't seem it, I don't know the answer to that. So one, I'm interested in your thoughts on that front currently, and where things stand. um but also, and maybe we can get into this a little bit more. I mean, the question, as you said, like, we're in a war now that you said it could be many years, right? And we've had a lot of conversations with Abdul Jawad Omar, and I remember in January or February, he had this kind of feeling of basically, I don't think it's going to be a short war. Like, I don't think it's going to be over in, a couple more months, or, something like that. And so I think, both of you are kind of in agreement that, this seems to be settling in to be a longer war. And I think with that, that also does raise the question for some of these regional actors, especially Hezbollah, because of proximity, and that's already been, quite a significant open front, even if it's not full scale war. There's been a lot of military activity, back and forth, and so yeah, how do you assess that front? And you mentioned how important, if things did scale up to another level, Hezbollah would be in terms of potentially the Mediterranean side of the conflict. Um, but yeah, what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Sure. So I remember in the beginning of the war, there were lots of questions whether Hezbollah will take part in the war or not. Uh, because of the scale of the 7th of October and the scale of Israeli retaliation, very early on in the war, everybody noticed and felt that this is not a war that Gaza can withstand alone. Even Hamas, no matter how prepared they were, just the scale and the sheer volume of the attack, the counterattack by Israel, meant that Hamas cannot withstand this alone. Palestinians cannot win alone. So there was lots of criticisms, lots of hopes, lots of worries about Hezbollah taking part and the extent to which its involvement is going to be effective in derailing and deterring Israel occupation plans in Gaza. And I remember the Hassan Nasrallah came out in the first speech and said, we're doing what is necessary, and the battlefield will decide what is appropriate, and people don't need to worry. People were very agitated and were frustrated because they saw and perceived that as Hezbollah not taking Gaza and not taking Palestine plea seriously enough and not being actively trying to stop the genocide. But obviously, I think the resistance had a plan from the beginning, which is a plan based on the logic of attrition. So the war was divided into different phases, different steps, points, and everybody is trying essentially to find the balance where they would accept an end to the war. And I think that's essentially what is happening. Everybody is trying to understand what is the limit of the other side so that Israel ultimately stops the war from the resistance side and point of view, and but also from Israel point of view that they achieve sufficient military objectives that they can call this off and restore their regional plans. But as you can see, both sides have very maximalist objectives. The resistance is asking Israel to admit defeat, and Israel is asking the resistance to admit defeat. So it's sort of a deaf conversation. I always find it funny when there are news items on the negotiations, and everybody is hopeful, cheerful, disappointed, happy, unhappy, and I'm like, yeah, I don't really care. Because at the end of the day, we have to understand that the negotiations ultimately will not get the war into an end because we both have very maximalist objectives, and unless one side compromises, it's not going to work. And the resistance can't compromise. What are they going to compromise on, right? So dragging back that conversation back to the situation in Lebanon, and that's essentially what Hezbollah has been doing: is calculated escalation as part of an iteration war led by the Palestinian resistance, with the plan and the vision that ultimately this will pressure Israel into ceasing its military operation to a great extent in Gaza, and that's essentially what the Lebanese Front ultimate goal. Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah has in many occasions now said that they would finish and end their military campaign in the north if Israel has ceased its operation in Gaza, and has said if an agreement is reached, Hezbollah will stop its military attacks. Now the question is, will Israel stop and will Hezbollah stop? Israel clearly can't stop because if the war ends in Gaza and Hezbollah stops, the solution in the north isn't solved yet, anyways. So it's not a solution for them. It's a no-go solution in a way. So ultimately, what they need to do, in my point of view, is to go to war in Lebanon, even if it's not something desirable, because the alternative is just purely admitting defeat without fighting for it. And frankly speaking, I don't think the Israelis are going to admit defeat. I think they are going to fight people off and the resistance on its winning, and it's going to be difficult. The timing of that, I think, it's sort of walking on an escalation ladder. As you saw in the beginning, the Hezbollah attacks were very kind of targeted, not that many attacks. Then the attacks became more intensified, bigger rockets were used, more advanced weapons, drones, anti-air missiles were used, and drones were shot down. And as of recent, we are also seeing more intensive attacks against secret military ties, military sites. Military sites that were constructed recently, they are showing more videos of their monitoring campaigns and surveillance of Israeli targets. So Hezbollah is clearly intensifying its military campaign as part of calculated escalation plan. I don't think Hezbollah is worried about going to a war, but doesn't necessarily perceive and see that going on a full war will ultimately lead to the objective you want, because ultimately you might slide into a more broader war, and that will make the war not about Gaza, but it will make it a global war where all is against all. And I think the resistance and Israel don't really want that to happen, so they are kind of maneuvering with this calculated escalation. Now, I think you know, if this round of negotiation fails, I think we're going for further escalation, and I think this is likely outcome because the United States and Israel understand that if they admit defeat now, it all goes south from there, so they can't do it, and the resistance will have to take it from them, and that will mean further military escalation, and we will see more uh, bloody targeting from both sides. So the resistance on our side killing targets from their side and vice versa. And yeah, we will see further escalation on an escalation ladder that might ultimately lead to a regional war because if that's what Israel wants and that's the only way to end this genocide, it has to go this way. And Nasrallah has said if the gates are open for war with Lebanon, it will be the game over game. Yemen is prepared for that. Many regional allies have also expressed interest in joining such a fight and supplying tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of fighters. And I think that this deterrence equation, while good and preventing regional war, uh, is not going to make the Israelis stop their genocide. As you can see, the Israelis see the genocide as something of existential nature to them, that without this genocide, there will be no more Israel. And sure, it might be bad that you have to conduct a genocide to ensure the survival of this racist entity, but that's an acceptable price. And therefore, I think while a lot of people are saying reasonably and understandably that there's not going to be a war in Lebanon because there's going to be destruction for both of them, but I think everybody's underestimating that for Israel, admitting defeat in only terms now is also seen as a destruction. So it's just that are you asking Israel to admit defeat and accept destruction regardless, or what are you exactly asking Israel? Not to fight for its own existence. Um, I am of the view that the Israelis will fight Palestinians for their existence or the existence of the state of Israel. And Hezbollah is going to be in the middle of that because if Israel wins in Palestine, they will destroy Lebanon. Sure, a lot of people say this war is not about Lebanon, we shouldn't get involved in that, etc. Um, it's just wishful thinking because ultimately, at the end of the day, the war is about Lebanon too and the future of Lebanon. And I kind of hate the fact that this is not really explicitly said. Like, if Gaza loses, it's the end for Lebanon too, and that's very important. And I think that's why I believe in the future there'll be more escalation in the north, and we could easily walk into a regional war. In my view, it's an extreme scenario, but I don't really foresee Israel stopping the genocide otherwise. They just don't care. Literally don't care. There's nothing politically, reasonably, or rationally anybody could say or do that will change the Israeli point of view on that. The only way you can do it is by force. I sadly say that, but this is where things are.
I appreciate all that. Your analysis of all that. I think so the so let's talk a little bit more about that. I mean, from the Israeli perspective, um, what what prevents them from achieving some sort of strategic victory currently? Is it just that from your perspective, that they're not going to be capable of eliminating Hamas? Is that essentially like, because I'm asking this question just to sort of play devil's advocate. It's not that I disagree with you, but that I can see people saying, well, they could impose some sort of, you know, uh, they're using aid as a weapon already in Gaza, right? And the lack of aid, the lack of food. We have famine. There was a Lancet article that came out this past week, a study that suggests that the death toll may not be 40,000, but it might be something closer to 186,000 Palestinians in Gaza. And so the question would be something along the lines of could Israel and the United States manage Gaza as a kind of conflict zone that's dependent upon aid that um, allows. I mean, yeah. So that's the question for me is like there's this question of the genocide has to continue, right? Because Israel can't achieve its strategic objectives. And, I hear that and I there's a lot of folks who've been on this platform that would agree with that assessment. Um, but I wonder you know, if you don't think that there's any alternatives. And I mean, and I guess the other way to flip it too would be to say, is there a world where you can see Palestine, Gaza, and the axis of resistance ultimately prevailing in this conflict? And I guess that's sort of related in some way, right? Because Israel accepting something less than a maximalist objective is in some ways admitting defeat from their point of view, right? So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Um, this is a very interesting question and quite a strategic one. And I think it's a very kind of common question to ask. But I think the problem is for many is that they think tactically and they don't really think strategically around the big picture level. And I think um, so. You're essentially asking who's going to win: Iran, its axis, Israel, and its axis. That's essentially the gist of the question. And I think the merit for Israel to win does not exist. The problem is now: does the merit for Iran and its allies winning exist? To some extent, but it's also not ensured because I think one thing that the Axis is underestimating is Israel's willingness and ability to continue disrupting their declaration of victory. Because one thing that Israel can do, and essentially is doing, is to keep doing what they're doing now. Keep the genocide going, slow process, keep cooking it until the Palestinians either give up or they manage to get more immigrants and more soldiers and more mercenaries who can continue this process of ethnic cleansing indefinitely until somebody gives up. So either the internal Israeli society goes crazy and believes in these ideas and allies with it, or they say we're fed up, we can't live like this anymore. This is inhumane for us. This is inhumane for other. Let's try to build a future together because we can't live like this. Um, and I think that's really the problem. Now, speaking on other factors that affect this sort of vision, so how do you define victory for Israel, regardless of what they say? Because sometimes you declare some objectives you don't intentionally mean all of them, or you're hiding something else in the mix. And I think for Israel, what we really want is full ethnic cleansing of Palestine. For them, as I said, in September last year, so literally just less than a year ago, Netanyahu stood in the United States, held the map for the region that did not have a Palestine on it. We, on the 7th of October, and the resistance that followed after, have disrupted that vision for not only Israel itself, not only Israel in the region, but even for the globe. So I want you to imagine in the audience how much pride they were living in, and then Palestinians brought it and crushed it down. For them, the only acceptable outcome, the only reasonable outcome, is to end this story once and for all. And now at least we can blame the Palestinians for it. And and that's really the strategic objective of Israel. Now, you can around that core objective, in my view, you can make all different sort of claims about it. But strategically, in their view, the end point for this war is the end of Palestine. That there will be no Palestine after this. There is no medium objectives. They think they've made a mistake in the 48 when they did not finish the job. And now that they have the opportunity to finish the job, that they should finish the job. And in my view, that's what they are going to do. That's what they're going to pursue. Uh, you can paint them in different pictures, in different scenarios, but that's really the core of their objective. which at its core will drive stronger, harder, a more popular resistance because nobody accepts genocide as a living condition, to the best of my understanding of humans. It's just something that nobody can live with. Now, on the other side of the coin, the Palestinian side of the coin and the Axis of Resistance coin, um, there is an objective that we demonstrated Israel weakness. We shown that Israel is a weak country, that it can't be the hegemon in the region, that it's hated by everybody, that it can't be normalized, it can't be integrated, it's not sustainable, it's non-feasible, and that's something they want to maintain. And to get to that point where they secure the achievements they have achieved on the 7th, they want this genocide to stop. That's why when you really talk about like the resistance making concessions, and I'm like, yeah, what concessions exactly are they expected to make? What, that you should stop killing people? What concession can the resistance make on a demand that you literally should stop killing people? It just can't be done because it's the basic minimum. All what the Palestinians are asking for then and now and overall is to live in dignity. And I think that's the essence of the problem, that the Israelis and the Americans and their allies refuse to let and allow Palestinians to live in dignity. And that's why we have to deal with weird situations like this. Um, Now, on the regional scale, we have two sort of axes, I would call it. One that is Iran sort of BRICS-led axis, and that's an odd one because it has Saudi and the UAE in it, and we can, shed some light on that later. But then you have the other one, which is led by Israel and the United States, and has some also of the Gulf countries in it, and by extension, Egypt, Morocco, and a little bit of Tunisia. And I think for these two axes, clearly, both are seeking to secure their supply lines, to secure their governments, their stability, their legitimacy, and that's what they are essentially fighting about now. And I do think that Iran has succeeded in changing its image in the region after it was disrupted by the Arab Spring and the different civil wars that the region has went into. But also the Gulf and Israel allies haven't really changed much. Sure, the EMEC was disrupted. Sure, they pursued the development road, which is an alternative to the EMEC, which connects the Gulf through Iraq to Turkey. Sure, the talks about the normalization between Saudi Arabia and the region is essentially ceased now, and is more of a low-level sort of conversation, and nobody is like seriously considering it to be the time for something like that. But ultimately, everybody is on the waiting. The region didn't really still fundamentally shift its agenda to become more pro-Palestine or more pro-Israel. I think everybody is just waiting where the tides will shift, because I think everybody is worried that if they make the jump first, change sides or whatever, then they will get caught up and they'll have to pay even a higher geopolitical price for their intervention. Um, Globally, we have, as I said, the BRICS, and we have the United States. I think that one of the kind of weird way these things have to kind of resolve themselves out is that now that the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi and Iran are part of BRICS, but are also regional rivals, how is that going to play out? Would it induce more conflict? Would it induce more agreements? Will it ruin BRICS? Will it make BRICS a better place? Will it make it more stagnant as it was earlier before they joined? I think these are bigger questions that are going to come into play as well. But in my head, we are in a war that's going to last many years. It's going to be something similar to Ukraine, on a step, on a ladder. In the beginning, the first year is like entrenchment, and the next year or the second half of this year, there'll be even worse and more complicated 3 months than the first month of the year, and then maybe next year the conflict and the war will have to come to some sort of understanding between Hamas. But then also you have the international equation, and frankly, I think there will be a war in Taiwan next year, maybe even this year, late this year, because you know China is seeing that the US is trying to make Taiwan into Ukraine and weaponizing it against it, and it has to stop that now. The better to do it now, the better that it's better to do it now than do it later. There is a historical opportunity that Ukraine and the Middle East is already making the United States quite busy. So there is this diffusion which already existed also back in the Cold War era, And I think ultimately China is going to use that kind of global dynamic to try to pursue its own objectives and trying to unify Taiwan, or at least prevent Taiwan from becoming another Ukraine that will harm it in the future overall.
That's fascinating and quite the prediction. So if that comes to pass, I will remember this and be sure to have you back on to have more conversation about that for sure.
What if it doesn't
So
pass
yeah,
though? You're gonna ignore me now.
what's that?
I said, what if it doesn't pass? What if my prediction doesn't happen? You're gonna ignore me. You're not
Oh no,
gonna
I
help.
won't ignore. I won't ignore you, but I will remind you that you predicted it. um, I mean, predictions it's a tricky thing, right? Because it's but I mean, it's certainly true in the United States that the level of anti-China propaganda is a constant thing, and it is at an extreme high. And there's a lot of I can see how one might feel that way, and certainly the US's role in Taiwan is extremely, belligerent and disruptive, and as it is in South Korea as well, and everywhere,
It's
everywhere
all
in the
linked.
world,
It's all
seemingly.
linked. Yeah, whether we like
Yeah,
it or not, it's all linked.
yeah. Um, So yeah, you mentioned too, and you said a little bit more about Saudi and UAE. I mean, that's one of the really interesting things because I think for a while I was following the brick stuff a little bit more closely, and it seems like you're really in tune with it, which I appreciate. Um, but I was very concerned, especially when Saudi. I mean, UAE is its own. They're both very dangerous in my view, kind of Western proxies. Obviously they do have their own regional um, rivalries and things like that, as you mentioned, with Iran specifically. But yeah, their involvement feels to me like a Trojan horse for the West in a lot of ways in BRICS, and I think that's a concerning development from my view. Um, the other thing
That's what I
I,
wrote when I wrote about it.
That's what you wrote. Okay, yeah, yeah. Well, we agree then. The yeah. So you talked about Syria, and I think that's an interesting, example to bring in as a potential right of you sort of for and yeah, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but something in terms of this is one of the possible ways you could see this war escalating is to something more like Syria, and obviously with Syria there were so many obviously international forces that got involved, imperialist forces, but also regional non-state forces, access forces, etc. And so what do you think would be I mean, I know again, I don't want to ask you to predict things that you can't possibly imagine, but what kind of thresholds do you think might bring something like that into play? Because I think for a lot of us, as you mentioned early on, we were talking about Hezbollah, and you said, there was a lot of people at the beginning of the war that thought Hezbollah might get very involved directly. Not that they haven't been involved, they have, but, to really um, have a higher, level of escalation. And we've talked about the escalation ladder, which access actors typically use to kind of, you know, moderately increase the level of involvement, retaliation, consequences, right? Um, and so imagining then to something like Syria to me is a fairly significant level of escalation to reach that point. But I also understand your point of if there's not an agreement that can be made because it's not tenable for Israel, they're too worried about admitting defeat and allowing their regional enemies to be victorious and to continue to operate and develop capacity for a war that will at some point reemerge, right? It's not like this conflict just goes away if there's a ceasefire. Um, so I can understand that. And then on, the Axis side, there's obviously the calculus that we've talked about a little bit too, of not yet, of course, wanting to really move into full scale all against all war. So yeah, how would you get in your vision to something like the Syrian war?
I think if the war in Lebanon takes place, we will end up in a Syria war situation. The borders will be opened and foreign fighters from everywhere will come, and Russia and China will provide strategic balancing vis-a-vis the United States, and it will be a many years sort of war. Uh, Essentially, it will be a civil war like Syria. Everybody will have to really, and some will, have to ally with the resistance. Other will ally with Israel. It's so this is the kind of conflict that, as you mentioned, there is no resolution to. We have to fight it out. And I say that with great grief and sorrow, but it's just the facts of life, that when two actors with different levels of power try to impose their will on each other, one of them has to succumb, the other side will at some point. And I think that's essentially the scenario where it will happen, because it will be a golden opportunity for Hezbollah to finish the job. Why would they waste that opportunity? If our Because there was some thinking in Israel that if we do this, like a mini campaign, we'll push Hezbollah out, we'll fool the Israelis in believing that we won, and we can get this international recognition, international resolution activated, etc. But the one that escalated the situation and claimed that this is not an option was Nasrallah. In a speech, he told Israel, look, if you go for a minor military campaign in Lebanon, for us, this is full war. No limits. We will do whatever it takes. We will go full on until the end. And he essentially set the escalation limit. And I think that's what is effectively deterring Israel from going to war in Lebanon, that ultimately, if this was just about a minor military campaign or a medium-sized military campaign, I think the Israelis would definitely have already been now in war in Lebanon. But they realize as well it's not an option. So now they have to choose between to go to full-on war, which they will have to go to anyways, like in 5-10 years anyway. It doesn't really matter. I mean, the war to end Israel is not going to be something that they can avoid, and they understand that, because the actors that want to do that essentially still have these plans and intentions. And after winning a war, this does, they're not going to change their mind or stop. And that's really the essence of the problem for them. That ultimately, uh, how do you stop a regional war from happening when the only way for you to achieve your objective, I mean the genocide the Israelis have in mind, is ultimately by withstanding a regional war. So that's the imbalance. And I think that the reasonable thing ultimately would be that the Israelis will wise up and will just say, look, the balance of power doesn't really work if we continue with the genocide. We may not succeed, but ultimately we'll endure quite a high cost and quite a high loss, and we don't want to do that. But that's not what's going to happen. And that's, I think, the sad part, that the Israeli society and the Israeli leadership have reached now to the plane that in their head, their demons are telling them that the only meaningful way out of this is to kill everybody. That's why even after now 10 months into the war, you still hear the Israeli rhetoric is quite genocidal. You see and you read the testimonies from the soldiers that were deployed into Gaza. There are clearly some intentions behind for a genocide in Gaza. And this is not only in Gaza; it's also now taking place in the West Bank. Now they are starting to, use air raids and homes to kill resistance fighter and destroy infrastructure and punish people. So in my view, the Israelis, in their head, they believe that the wise thing, that the right thing, that the moral thing for them, that the wise thing for them to do is to eliminate Palestine. to finish the job, to end Palestine and Palestinians once and for all. I know well that the only way around this maximalist vision and view and goals is to counter it with war ultimately. And I think that's where we're gonna be ending too. If not today, it's gonna be tomorrow. It's inevitable because you can't really change the mind of the Israelis. That Israelis genuinely believe, they say it on public TV, that they believe genocide is a politically good idea and that's the way to go. How can any Palestinian or any leader or anybody for that matter do anything about that? Like, what do you want me to do? What's the solution around that? If somebody comes to your house and say, "Look, the only solution for me is to destroy your house and to kill you and your family," like, what do you want me to do?
I want you to fight. Yeah, I mean, I think the I appreciate this because I think also it helps this conversation and talking through these potentialities and so on. I hope that as people are listening, it helps clarify also stakes of support outside of Palestine, right? Because I think that in the West we have been a lot, people were very focused on ceasefire resolutions and things like that. We've seen how even that the language around it, what has basically been co-opted into is um, a way of politicians saying, yeah, I'm for ceasefire, and what they mean by ceasefire is Palestine admitting defeat. That they mean the resistance laying down its
Return of the
arms.
hostages.
Yeah, return the hostages, lay down your arms,
Somehow
give up.
they
And
and I always think it's interesting that somehow they always forget that Israel has effectively taken 6 million Palestinians as hostage for many, many, many decades. I mean, being in an occupation, what you're essentially a hostage, but not just that one individual, but a whole political polity, and a whole society. But nobody talks about us as hostages. But like the 100 or whatever, 100 something Israelis kept in Gaza, they are the hostages. But I am not a hostage. I'm not allowed to go visit my family. I'm not allowed to send them aid normally. I'm not allowed to see them have a good time. I'm not allowed to see them have a good education. That's not, we're not hostages, but the Israelis are the hostages. And I find that to be completely inhumane to think that way.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, we had I remember Rawan Masri at one point, we had her on and she said, she said, from my point of view, every Palestinian is a prisoner, and
It's true. It's
so
true.
yeah. Um, but anyways, continuing on with what I was thinking there, I mean, the answer is ultimately in this type of scenario that you're laying out is, do you support the resistance, right? Or do you support the state of Israel? I mean, those are really, it's not a question of just a amorphous kind of peace or ceasefire, these things in a kind of war where, Israel views genocide as the objective and as an existential sort of requirement. Um, and if not genocide, maybe it's just full Palestinian capitulation and defeat, and and again, like, that's not dignity or something that Palestinians can ultimately accept in the long term, right? And so, or any human could accept, right, to be treated as subhuman human animals, right, as Golant said. And so yeah, I mean, I hope that clarifies for people too as they're listening to this conversation that um yeah, I mean, we need to be thinking about how do we develop fronts, campaigns, etc., that actually um at the very least are harmful towards the US and Israel and the continuance of this genocide, if people want to look at it that way, or they can look at it as, support for the resistance in the ways that they are able to do so. Obviously, the laws and things like that in the West make that difficult in all the ways that you laid out, in terms of the inability to materially support and things like that. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's anyway, I just wanted to say that. Yeah, so audience, if there are any questions for you, for Ahmed, we definitely would take them. I don't know if there's other things that you wanted to get to, Ahmed, that I didn't give you space for, or that you would like to add.
Um, hmm, Not really specifically, but um, I just want to thank all those who have been for the past 9, 10 months, and even from the years before, trying to help Palestine and Palestinians, trying to help stop this genocide. Uh, you know, it's the right fight for humanity. It's not just a fight for Palestine, and we have to stand up together in this. Otherwise, they will literally do it elsewhere as well. Honestly, if we don't stop the Gaza genocide, I am in all sincerity and literally, I just don't know what will stop them from doing this elsewhere. Nothing. That's how dangerous the situation is.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I you elaborated that too in your discussion with Sina, on the East is a podcast, that and I think that that's true. One, the conversation about how all of these technologies, whether it's even in normal times, quote unquote, right, the surveillance, the ways that Palestinians are divided from one another geographically, and all of these things, the policing technologies, checkpoints and so on, that they get exported, they get used, they get tested out on Palestinians become, and the great folks with um Palestine Action, who've done the work, on disrupting Elbit, talk about this really well, in terms of the way that Elbit Systems as a company, markets their products in terms of, hey, we've already proved that this works on Palestinians, so you can use it elsewhere. And that's the kind of everyday aspect of it. But as we've seen, I mean, the horrors are that have come out of Gaza are just unimaginable. I mean, every day I see something. The other day I saw a video, kids, young men playing soccer, at a UNRWA school or whatever, that was like a camp that people had already been displaced to probably 3 or 4 times before they get to this place. And you just see a video of a rocket striking the school and people running around trying to, I mean, it's heinous, and we've seen so many images like that for 9 months now. And the fact that these things are still happening every day, um yeah, I mean, I hope that, I know that there was a lot kind of going on college campuses in the US, and then, of course, summer came, and, now we have the elections, which are just this horrible, mockery of us all, basically. Um, but, I hope that people continue to refocus their energy on ways that they can support and, be in the struggle, for Palestinians, and, as you say, for all of us, because it does impact all of us. But even if it didn't, I think that it's the struggle of our lifetimes that is going on. And yeah, so I appreciate you, Ahmed, and your time and your thoughts. I encourage people. I added stuff to the show description. Um, One other thing I should note is that folks can also follow you on Twitter, and I'm going to put that. This is the isn't that right? Mana Unleashed. Yes. All right, cool. Follow you on Twitter, there, and see more of your work. I did put a link to your Substack that people can check out. Also, if they just Google your name, they'll come up with a bunch of different articles that you've written. um, about Palestine, but also a lot about trade and political economy in the region that I think is really helpful for folks. So I'm honored that we've been able to have you here today. And yeah, free Palestine.
Thank you so much, Jared, and thank you for the audience for listening in.
Thank you.